In this video, I want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which represent the pillars of Marxism and the cancer of a free and open society. Such terms may look somewhat benign on paper, but in reality, they make up the smiling face of a soft-spoken mass murderer whose life story has been told countless times in our history books. But before getting into it, I want to premise this video with my own definition of what a Marxist happens to be in 21st century Ireland. A Marxist is a person whose obsession with victimhood and oppression is only matched by their most envious lust for power and to be perceived as virtuous. Indeed, his fixation moves into the realm of psychopathy, megalomania, and deep narcissism, as he weaponizes compassion to attain unearned social status. Such people, believing themselves to be the arbiters of morality, endlessly scan the world through subjective eyes, constantly seeking out perceived injustices to correct. However, the Marxist, basking in the glory of his fictitious benevolence and self-righteousness, is only ever capable of alleviating the oppression he finds or manifests by employing the use of more oppression, and therefore maximizing the potential for suffering. And with all that said, diversity. Diversity is the attempt to change the demographics of a nation, to erode a nation's culture, to reconstitute power dynamics, and to change societal norms around matters of sex and sexuality to bring about utopia. In order to achieve this aim, the Marxist has chosen the tactics of divide and conquer by splitting society into various groups depending on immutable characteristics, identity, but most importantly, political philosophy. Once divided into these groups, typically called communities, they are rank ordered on a hierarchy, measuring from the privileged to the victimized, in order to decide who in society should be labelled as the oppressor and the oppressed, hence creating a good versus evil scenario under false pretense. In reality, this process of division has simply served to place those who favour communism into the so-called oppressed communities, with everyone else gaining membership as part of the oppressor communities. And I want to stress that a person's political philosophy is the ticket by which he is granted membership to an oppressed group. If one does not take a Marxian view of the world, then one is not part of the club. And it doesn't matter how many identity boxes are checked. You could be a black, gay, trans woman in a wheelchair, but if you don't tend towards the communist left, you're out and deemed a threat. Once divided, the next phase is to gain political sway, which is achieved in the following way. A number of fraudulent champions rise from within the ranks of the oppressed groups to represent the demands of those who claim victimhood, and using their status as virtuous defenders and protectors of society's weakest, they employ a strategy that is so simple it's absurd. They manipulate and distort language and words. They lie and defame their opposition, and they call everything they want to control hateful, racist, homophobic, transphobic, and so forth until they control it, thereby granting them power over each domain coveted. Indeed, I can refer to a number of familiar examples to justify this claim. If you want to legalize abortion, just call it reproductive health care and label your opponent as anti-choice. If you want to legalize gay marriage, simply badmouth the church and call those in opposition homophobic and regressive. If you want children to accept gender ideology, simply groom them in school under the guise of education and call any parents who dare to interfere transphobic. If you want to censor freedom of speech, express the notion that words are dangerous and akin to violence, and call anyone in disagreement a hateful bigot. This method of persuasion, involving the fabrication of injustice to coerce submission through dishonest means, is despicable but extremely effective. Indeed, the Marxist knows all too well that cries of bigotry, even without sufficient evidence, are enough to provoke those in power to act on their behalf. Equity. Equity is a term often confused with equality or fairness, and I intend to illustrate how destructive, evil, and ultimately murderous it is to pursue equity as a foundational or governing principle. But first, I will distinguish the difference between equality and equity, and I will then expand on the latter. Equality refers to the notion that all of us are equal before God. It takes not into consideration a person's immutable characteristics, financial status, past hurt or trauma, and so on. Equality, when applied as intended, is the notion that we are all human and that we all possess inherent potential. In a society that values equality as a governing principle, individuals are given the same opportunities to succeed based on competence, merit, and productivity, with little to nothing else taken into consideration. The application of special treatment for individuals or groups under this system is simply viewed as repugnant. All men and women involved begin their journeys towards prosperity by towing the same start line and reacting to the same gunshot. This, most importantly, also pertains to treatment before the law, with everyone being treated as equal. However, equity, as a governing principle, is much different. It refers to creating an equal outcome with respect to a person's needs, by way of a dictating force offering resources to some and erecting barriers for others. I will refer to the following image to illustrate my point. Equality ensures that every individual has an equal opportunity to earn a box based on talent and merit and free from external interference, whereas equity is the process by which a central governing authority seizes all the boxes by force and redistributes them in accordance with a person's perceived needs. Equality and equity is the difference between success earned through hard work and success gained through the immoral use of force, pretending to be pity. And if you think that definition sounds an awful lot like communism, you would be right. Communism was adopted to solve the problem of poverty in a society by sacrificing private property rights in favour of a dictatorship mandated to forcefully acquire all resources for redistribution, which we all know leads to misery incalculable. Today's iteration of communism, or more widely known as wokeism, wants to go beyond its predecessor by attempting to solve every conceivable problem in a society through the forceful seizure of all rights, freedoms, civil liberties, opportunities, property, wealth, and all other resources for equitable redistribution. And I'm not being facetious. Equity, at its heart, is the Marxist attempt at solving the problem of oppression by employing the use of more oppression, and it is the basis for communism. In fact, one of the best examples in the world of this stupid system can be viewed here in Ireland, as Minister for Justice Helen McEntee is attempting to create an equitable society through the introduction of hate crime legislation. McEntee's laws seek to obtain by force the rights of every citizen and redistribute said rights on the basis of victimhood, which is to be calculated using the process of diversity. Allow me to elaborate. McEntee wants to solve the problem of perceived racism by dividing every man, woman, and child into groups based on race, and granting us all more or less special privileges before the law based on the colour of our skin to achieve racial equity. Evidently, McEntee is a racist. She also wants to solve the problem of perceived homophobia by dividing us all into groups based on sexuality, and again, granting us more or less privileges before the law depending on our sexual preferences. This, of course, is discrimination based on sexuality, ironically highlighting McEntee as heterophobic, homophobic, and biphobic. Indeed, this legislation, supported by 110 moronic TDs, requires that our judges assess every plaintiff and defendant by age, sex, gender, race, religious beliefs, sexuality, and the rest before making a judgment and issuing a conviction. Such a system, brought to us by people who deserve to be hung, actually sows discrimination into the fabric of our society for the sake of a perverted notion of equity. And again, I must reiterate, a Marxist is only ever able to solve the problem of perceived oppression by engaging in more oppression. Other policies of special treatment, for example, quotas in the workplace for women or homosexuals or whatever, are also discriminatory and oppressive, as it demands that a path is cleared to help a chosen demographic, while barriers are erected to halt the progress of others. Continuing to its logical conclusion, equity, or communism, or wokeism seeks to control every single aspect of human life, including nature. There is no problem too difficult for a Marxist government to tackle for an equitable outcome. You have a problem with poverty? Don't worry. Government will forcefully acquire all property and wealth for redistribution. Upset about past injustices, government will order reparations be paid to those several generations removed from the atrocity. Can't get a job because you happen to be black, or gay, or trans. Government will actively oppress straight white men so that your opportunities are plentiful through quotas. Are you worried about going hungry? Government will take ownership of the means necessary to grow and harvest food, with a view to supplying you with the relevant amount of calories to sustain you. Do you fear catching the latest mutation of the flu? Government will ensure that every man, woman, and child is vaccinated. I submit, having to make a case against totalitarianism in 2023 is genuinely disturbing to me. But moving on. Inclusivity. Inclusivity is a word used to subvert your good nature by emotionally blackmailing you into accepting diversity and equity. It is a word with a double meaning when uttered by the communist, suggesting that tolerance is the goal and all people of different walks of life are welcome. However, disagree with the measures taken to promote diversity and equity, and you will be subjected to inclusivity's alternate meaning, which is to say, you'll be ostracized, shamed, and labeled with various words ending with phobia. For who would reject diversity and equity if not a bigot? The relationship between diversity, equity, and the term inclusion is one of reinforcement, and I submit it is a genius method employed to force submission through bullying disguised as tolerance and compassion. Indeed, nobody wants to be called a racist or homophobe in modern society, especially when you have an income to protect or a family to feed. It is much easier to keep your head down and to mutter your discontent quietly, far from judgmental ears, than it is to challenge those seeking to exercise their false moral authority over us all. In short, inclusivity simply means submit to the Marxist agenda or suffer the ruination of your life through character assassination or worse. In closing, I wish to say the following. I told you at the beginning of this video that the Marxist, being mentally ill, is only ever capable of solving the problem of perceived oppression by employing the use of more oppression. I hope that point is clear now. And with that being said, I will end by surmising diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is the erosion of Irish culture in favour of other, preferably non-white cultures. It is the queering and sexualisation of society through indoctrination. Equity refers to the fatally flawed Marxist idea that in order to create a fairer society, individuals and groups must forfeit their rights, freedoms, opportunities, and wealth in favour of a benevolent dictatorship who will take charge over all resources to account for perceived victimhood. Or more to the point, it is communism. And inclusion is a word used to make you accept it all or suffer the Marxist wrath.